Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video.
Thanks for watching. Follow a brighter destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
My father built Bennett Ridge machinery with his hands, one contract at a time, in a town called Cedar Falls, Montana, where the logging companies needed equipment and nobody wanted to drive 4 hours to Missoula to get it. He started with a single leased garage in 1987. By the time I was born, he had 2 warehouses, 11 trucks, and a reputation that meant more than any contract clause ever could. Walter Bennett didn't believe in shortcuts. He believed in showing up at 6:40 in the morning and staying until the job was actually finished, not until the clock said it was. I came home to help him when I was 26. I had a job offer in Seattle worth $71,400 a year, benefits included, and I turned it down to sit across a folding table from a man who still wrote invoices by hand. People asked me why. I never had a clean answer for them, not one that fit in a sentence. The truth was that I understood something about that business my father never fully said out loud. It was healthy. It was also fragile, built entirely around one man's memory and one man's handshake, and if anything ever happened to him, there would be nothing holding it together but habit. So I learned it from the ground up. Every supplier contract, every service agreement, every client my father had shaken hands with instead of putting in writing. What I found in that first year was a company that had been running on goodwill it hadn't earned in over a decade. My father hadn't renegotiated a vendor rate since 2009. He trusted people the way you trust family, which is to say, completely and without a second look. I didn't tear anything down. I built slowly, and I let the numbers argue for themselves. In 6 years, revenue went from just under $2 million to $5,830,000. We picked up 3 regional mining contracts my father never thought we'd land. My father was proud in the quiet way men like him are proud of things. He never said it directly. He just stopped double-checking my decisions somewhere around year 3. And for a man like Walter Bennett, that was the whole speech. My older brother noticed the growth too. He drew a very different conclusion from it. Trevor had worked at Bennett Ridge since he was 22, mostly in operations, mostly in the parts of the job that involved a firm handshake and a good table manner at client dinners. He assumed the company would land in his hands eventually, not because he'd built anything toward that, but because he was the oldest son, and in his mind that settled the matter before it was even raised. He could run a room. He could not read a balance sheet without someone walking him through it line by line, and he knew that about himself, though he'd never once said it out loud to me or to anyone. My younger sister Renee handled the books. She was sharp, controlled, and always had an explanation ready before you finished asking the question. My father trusted her completely. I trusted her less the longer I watched her work, though for a long time I couldn't have told you why. There was something in the way her numbers moved just slightly faster than the story behind them. Our Uncle Hank, my mother's brother, ran the warehouses and the vendor contracts. He'd been there longer than I'd been alive and treated the job like something he'd inherited rather than earned. He was the kind of man who had a gift for making sure his own interests lined up with his professional decisions, and an even bigger gift for making sure nobody could ever quite prove it. My father died on a Tuesday in March. Heart attack, fast, no warning, no goodbye. I was 3 hours away in Billings finalizing a contract when Trevor called me, and by the time I got back for the funeral, something in the company had already shifted in ways I hadn't caught yet. My mother, Louise, took a board seat that was mostly ceremonial and treated it like it was absolute. Trevor stepped into daily leadership like he'd been standing in that spot his whole life, just waiting for someone to move. And I kept doing what I'd always done, the contracts, the client relationships, the supplier negotiations, because the work still needed doing and I was still the only one who knew how. For almost 2 years I told myself the discomfort I felt was grief wearing a strange shape. I told myself Trevor's decisions would make more sense once he settled in. I told myself Renee's numbers just needed a different kind of explaining. I was wrong about all of it, and here's the part nobody tells you about being wrong that way. You hold on to the wrong explanation longer than you should. Because the true one means admitting people you grew up with have been doing something you can't forgive. It wasn't one dramatic moment that broke it open. It was a Thursday afternoon, 4:12 p.m., and I was pulling numbers for a new client who wanted a clean financial picture of the company. A vendor payment didn't line up, not dramatically the kind of gap you could explain away as a billing cycle quirk if you didn't know these books the way I did. But I did know them, so I kept pulling threads. 3 weeks later I had my answer, and it wasn't the answer I wanted. Bennett Ridge was carrying debt nowhere near what showed up in the reports I had access to. Several of our largest vendor payments were routing to companies that, once I traced the paperwork, led straight back to Hank. The rates were well above market. Renee had built a sub-account structure that made the payments look like routine operating costs, clean enough to pass every internal review without a flag ever raised. And Trevor had known. Not only known, he'd been using the distorted numbers to justify taking out a new secured loan against the main production facility. A loan that would have pumped in enough cash to mask the bleeding for another 2 years, minimum. For that loan to close, the bank needed signatures from every major shareholder. My father had left me a real stake in the company. That meant they needed me. Trevor called a family meeting. He laid out the loan like it was opportunity expansion, modernization, securing the future, all the language people use when they need you to stop asking questions. Renee had slides ready that made the numbers look manageable. Hank sat at the far end of the table and said almost nothing, which is how he operated whenever something important was on the line. My mother sat in my father's old chair and watched me the way she always watched me when she expected me to fall in line. I told them I wouldn't sign, not without an independent audit first. I said it as plainly as I could, without accusing anyone of anything, because some part of me still didn't want to say out loud what I was starting to believe. I told them if the company's condition was really what they were describing, an audit would confirm it, and the loan would sail through without a hitch. The room went still in a way rooms only go still when everyone in it knows something is about to be named that can't be unnamed. Trevor said I'd never once trusted him to run anything. Renee gave me the look she always gave me when she'd decided I was being difficult on purpose. My mother said the thing she always said when she needed the family to close ranks. Family protects family. She said it like it was a law of physics instead of a choice she was making, as if she hadn't noticed the protection only ever seemed to flow in one direction. And I said, for the first time in my life, clearly in that room, with all 4 of them watching protecting family doesn't mean helping family steal. Nothing that had been possible before that sentence was possible after it. Everyone in that room understood that. 2 weeks later, my mother called about the annual trip to Widow's Ridge. She framed it the way she always framed it, a family tradition, a way to honor my father's memory before the anniversary of his death. He used to take us up into those mountains every winter, and he loved the particular quality of silence above the tree line, where the wind moved and nothing man-made answered back. He'd told us once he wanted his own ashes scattered near Copper Notch, the overlook past the old ranger cabin, and after he died, that's exactly what we did. I didn't want to go. I went anyway, because some part of me still believed in a version of this family that Tripp was supposed to represent, and because I thought maybe distance from the office might make an honest conversation possible. I was wrong about that too. Keep that in mind because it matters later. The last time I trusted my own optimism, it nearly cost me everything. We drove up on a Friday morning. The cabin near Copper Notch was the same one my father had kept solid for 30 years. Nothing beautiful about it, built to last through anything. Saturday was civil in the careful, brittle way people are civil when they've silently agreed to pretend. By Saturday afternoon, the pretending ran out of road. Trevor brought the loan documents on the hike. We were moving up the trail toward the overlook, the same path we'd walked 2 years before, to scatter my father's ashes. Same cold, same thin air at 8,200 feet. He stopped, pulled the folder from his pack, and held it out to me like this was the last kindness he'd ever offer. I said no. I told him that when we got back down, I was calling an independent auditor and a corporate attorney, and whatever they found would decide what happened next to the loan and to my place in the company. I said it knowing exactly what it meant. I think even then some part of me believed there were lines they wouldn't cross. I had sat at Thanksgiving tables with these people. I had watched Trevor's kids grow up. You don't arrive easily at the understanding that people you love are capable of what came next. I lost my footing on a slick patch of rock, turning to head back down. My ankle went sideways and I hit the ground hard enough that putting weight on it wasn't an option. I reached out for a handhold and I looked to Trevor, 'cause he was closest. He reached for my pack instead. Not roughly, carefully, almost gently, which was somehow worse than if he'd been rough about it. He set it down out of reach. Renee was already at the pocket of my jacket, where she'd watched me put my phone that morning. She took it without a word. Hank had been standing off to the side, and he stepped in and picked my keys up off the ground where they'd fallen. I told myself they were making a point, a show of leverage, a way to remind me how much I needed their cooperation to get off that mountain. I told myself that because the alternative, the thing that was actually happening, wasn't something I was ready to look at yet. They turned and started down. I called after Trevor first, then Renee, then Hank. None of them slowed. My mother had been standing about 10 feet back through the whole thing. I turned to her the way you turn to the last person in the room you believe still has a limit. I asked her to call for help. I told her the temperature was dropping, and there was weather coming in fast from the northwest. You could see it in how the sky had gone the color of wet slate over the last hour. I asked her not to leave me there. She looked at me for a long moment. Not unkind exactly, settled. Like a decision that had already been made internally, and what remained was just the physical act of walking away from it. She said if I came back, I'd destroy this family. Then she turned and followed the others down the mountain, and I want you to sit with that for 1 second before we go any further, because it's the hinge this whole story turns on. I understood then, with the kind of clarity that only shows up once every explanation has run out, that this wasn't a demonstration. They had stood there and calculated an outcome and decided it was acceptable, and then they had walked away from it. The storm came in faster than the forecast said it would. No phone, no pack, no real weight on my left foot, and the temperature dropping in at that stepped way it does at altitude, not gradual, but sudden, each drop colder than the last. I moved the only way I could, off the exposed trail and down into the tree cover, and it took me close to 3 hours to find the old ranger station I remembered from a hike years earlier. Abandoned, but it had 4 walls and half a roof, enough to cut the worst of the wind. I stayed there almost 2 full days. When a geological survey crew found me on Monday morning at approximately 9:15, I was deep into hypothermia and couldn't stand without support. They called it in and stayed with me until the ambulance arrived 40 minutes later. The sheriff's office reached out to my family. Trevor told them I'd gotten upset during the hike, argued with the group, and walked off on my own, that they'd searched and couldn't find me, and eventually assumed I'd made my own way down. No cameras on that trail, no other witnesses, nothing that would let anyone prove what had actually happened. I spent 4 days in the hospital in Kalispell. Surgery on the ankle. My core temperature had dropped low enough in the first 24 hours that the attending physician used the word critical twice in one conversation. On the 4th day, I checked myself out and drove to a motel in a town I'd never been to before, and I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time. I thought about going to the sheriff with my own account. I thought about hiring an attorney and taking the company's books to court. I thought about driving back to Cedar Falls and putting everything I knew on the table in front of all 4 of them at once. But I had been on that mountain. I had watched my mother turn her back. I understood, without any room left for revision, exactly what my family was willing to let happen to protect what they'd built. And I understood something else, sitting on that motel bed at 11:40 at night with a boot cast on my leg. Going back to reclaim my old seat at Bennett Ridge wasn't what I wanted anymore. What I wanted was something they hadn't thought to defend against, because it required more patience than any of them had ever shown for anything in their lives. I didn't want my place back. I wanted the whole thing. I left Montana on a Tuesday morning in November with 2 duffel bags, a laptop, and $9,300 in cash I'd been careful about saving. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't leave a forwarding address. A friend from graduate school had a spare room in Millbrook, Oregon, and offered it to me for as long as I needed. And that was the entire plan, which at the time felt like more than enough. The first thing I did was sleep for 2 days straight. The second thing I did was sit down with a legal pad, not a laptop, a legal pad, because I didn't trust any device I'd used while I was still inside that company, and write out, from memory, everything I'd found in those books before I lost access to them. I wanted a record while it was still sharp in my head. Then I set the pad aside and started building something new. Ridgeline Procurement Group started as 1 room and 2 people, me, and a logistics analyst named Sam Whitaker, who'd worked under me at Bennett Ridge for 4 years and who followed me to Oregon without asking for much more explanation than the situation at home has become untenable, and I think we can build something worth the risk. He said yes before I finished the sentence. It took us 7 months before we could afford to fill the 3rd desk in that room. What we did in those early months was the same work I'd always done, just without an established name behind it. We helped mid-sized companies untangle supply chains, renegotiate vendor rates that had drifted years above market, restructure procurement operations well enough to keep some of them out of bankruptcy court entirely. I had no reputation in Oregon that meant a thing to anyone. What I had was the ability to walk into a room, look at a set of numbers, and see the actual problem faster than anyone else at the table. It turned out that was enough to land the first client. The first client's results were enough to land the second. By the end of year 1, we had 6 active clients. By the end of year 2, we'd moved into a real office, added 3 staff, and closed our first enterprise-level contract with a regional construction firm, a single deal worth more than everything we'd built in our first 12 months combined. I want to pause here because this is the part of the story people skip past to get to the revenge, and it's the part that actually matters most. I did not spend those 2 years plotting. I spent them building. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference. It was my attorney, a quiet, precise man named Owen Pierce, who brought Bennett Ridge back into my line of sight. He'd worked with Ridgeline since our 2nd year and had learned not to waste words in front of me, because I'd just wait him out until he got to the point. He called on a Wednesday at 2:30 in the afternoon and asked for half an hour. I said yes, and he showed up with a folder he set on my desk without a word of preamble. A regional bank was quietly shopping a distressed debt position, a secured loan gone into technical default after 18 months of covenant violations. The borrower was Bennett Ridge Machinery. The collateral was the main production facility in Cedar Falls. Without new capital, the company would lose the facility within months, and after that, bankruptcy reorganization was the most likely outcome. I looked at that folder for a long time before I opened it. I was aware of exactly what I was feeling, and I was aware it wasn't a useful guide for what I should do next, so I made myself wait a beat before I asked Owen how this had crossed his desk. A boutique advisory firm he had a relationship with had flagged it, looking for buyers who actually understood industrial equipment. Owen knew enough of my history to flag it for me specifically, and he believed strictly on the financial merits that the underlying business still had real recoverable value under whatever damage had been done to it. I asked him for a week before we talked further. Then I opened the folder. The independent audit Owen commissioned came back with 2 kinds of news. The expected kind: the company was in genuinely serious trouble. Trevor had taken on debt at a pace that only made sense if the growth I'd built kept climbing forever, which it hadn't, because the clients I'd personally landed had started leaving within 8 months of my departure. Funny. 2 of our biggest enterprise accounts had gone straight to competitors, the unexpected kind. The bones were still solid. The technical crew my father had spent 30 years building was still largely intact. Funny. The equipment inventory, poorly managed but still valuable. The supplier network, the relationships with haulers and manufacturers that made the whole thing useful, hadn't disappeared just because nobody had tended to it, because those relationships were structural, built into geography and history in a way that outlasts bad management. Funny. What I was looking at was a company damaged by its leadership, not by its market. That's a different kind of problem. Funny. A much more solvable one. I told Owen to proceed, and I told him exactly how. Funny. We built a holding company at arm's length from Ridgeline, layered with intermediary structures, every single piece of it legal, every piece of it fully defensible under regulatory scrutiny, but organized so the ultimate beneficial owner wouldn't show up on a routine search. Funny. I wasn't willing to do anything I couldn't stand behind in open court. What I wanted was enough time to close the acquisition before anyone in that family figured out who was sitting on the other side of the table, because the second they knew, they'd find a way to make it messy. Funny. Through the holding structure, we bought the distressed debt from the bank at a meaningful discount. The bank preferred a clean exit over a drawn-out default fight. Funny. We then approached 2 minority shareholders, old friends of my father's who'd watched the company decay under Trevor with visible frustration, and bought their stakes at fair value. Funny. It didn't take much convincing. By the time it was all done, the holding company controlled enough debt and equity to decide the outcome of any restructuring on its own terms. Funny. The family had no idea. They knew some outside investor had shown interest in the debt. They assumed, the way people who have built anything from scratch tend to assume, that it was some distant institution chasing a return, with no particular interest in the company's internal history. Funny. It was 3 weeks into due diligence that I found the second layer of what my family had done, and this is the part that changed something in me permanently. Funny. Reviewing the archived internal communications that came over as part of the debt purchase, I found that in the months after Copper Notch, Trevor had told several key clients and partners that I'd suffered a serious mental health crisis and left the company abruptly, unstable, unreliable. The company was better off now that things had stabilized. Funny. He hadn't said this to explain my absence. He'd said it to make sure that if I ever came back with my own version of events, nobody would believe a word of it. Funny. I also found that Trevor had taken personal credit in at least 2 industry presentations for 3 major contracts I had personally negotiated. Funny. And I found something worse than either of those. Renee had reclassified a set of expense entries, the cost tied directly to the vendor fraud she and Hank had been running, and dated them to make it look like the irregularities originated in my old division, back when I was still nominally with the company. Funny. They hadn't just left me on that mountain and hoped I wouldn't come back. They had spent the following months making sure that if I did, no one would believe a single word out of my mouth. Funny. I read through all of it alone in my office on a Saturday evening, 7:50 p.m., after everyone else had gone home. Funny. I sat with it until I understood it fully, and then I went home and made dinner and watched something forgettable on television and made myself sleep, because I had learned by then that decisions made in the hot part of a feeling are almost always worse than the ones made after the feeling has been acknowledged and set down. Funny. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to do it right, not fast. Trevor hadn't been idle. Funny. He understood a serious creditor had taken a position and, true to form, treated it like a political problem to route around instead of an operational one to solve. Funny. He shopped the company to 3 private lenders and 1 regional investment group. None of them moved forward once they ran their own numbers. Funny. Renee started softening several of the financial disclosures to make the company look more creditworthy than it was. Funny. Hank, whose focus had quietly shifted from extraction to self-protection, tried moving key vendor contracts out of the main entity into subsidiary shells, a move that, if it had gone through, would have stripped recoverable value out of the company before any change of ownership could reach it. Owen caught it fast. We'd been tracking the filings as part of ongoing diligence, and he moved to block the transfers through every mechanism a secured creditor has available. Because our legal position was airtight, it worked. Most of what Hank tried to move stayed exactly where it was. Then, late on a Thursday night, 11:20 p.m., Owen called with the kind of controlled voice he used when he was managing something he didn't want to blow up unnecessarily. Hank's attorney had gone digging through the ownership chain, looking for grounds to challenge our standing as creditors. And they'd found a thread an early investor in the holding entity connected, indirectly but traceably, to someone who'd once shown up in Bennett Ridge's vendor records. It would take real work to follow that thread to its end. But if they got there before the transaction closed, they had enough to seek a delay, and a delay was all they needed to buy time for the financing they hadn't found yet. We had less than 12 hours before final documents were due for execution. Owen already had a plan. He just needed the go-ahead. I gave it to him, and we worked through the night, Owen, his team, and me restructuring the exposed piece of the holding entity in a way that was airtight and, from the outside, invisible. By 6 a.m. it was closed off. By 8 Owen was driving to Cedar Falls. At 9 that morning in the Bennett Ridge boardroom, Trevor, Renee, Hank, and my mother signed the restructuring agreement. Under its terms, the holding company acquired 72% ownership of Bennett Ridge Machinery in exchange for retiring the majority of its debt and injecting the working capital the company needed to stay alive. Trevor objected loudly more than once. My mother, flat and certain, told him there was no other option on the table. He signed. They all signed. When it was done, Trevor looked across the table at Owen and asked when he'd finally meet the new owner. Owen closed his case, checked the time, and told him the new owner would be in this same room at 9:00 tomorrow morning. Trevor nodded, like that was a perfectly reasonable courtesy being extended to him. He had no idea it was the last hour of something that was already over. I drove to a motel in Cedar Falls that night and sat there for a while. I thought about my father. I thought about the compass he used to carry into those mountains, brass, worn smooth on the edges, from 30 years of handling that I'd carried out of the woods in my jacket pocket the night the survey crew found me, and kept in a small wooden box on my desk in Millbrook for 3 years. He'd taught me once that a compass doesn't care where you're standing or how lost you feel. It only points to true north, and from there, you figure the rest out yourself. I turned off the light and went to sleep because I had a feeling I'd need that lesson again in the morning. I was right. I got to the Bennett Ridge building at 8:45. I sat in the parking lot for a minute, not hesitation, just the simple need to look at that building before I walked back into it. I hadn't been back to Cedar Falls since the hospital. It looked exactly the same. Same gray metal facade, same raised letters over the door, same row of service trucks along the east fence. My father had bought one at a time over 20 years. From the street, you'd never know how close to the edge it was standing. Owen was waiting at the entrance. We walked in together. The receptionist looked up, recognized Owen, started the standard greeting, and then saw me, and whatever she saw in my face after 3 years stopped her mid-word. I smiled at her and kept walking. The boardroom door was closed, but through the glass I could see all of them. Trevor at the head of the table, Renee to his left, Hank at the far end. My mother positioned at Trevor's right, close enough to the center to look like authority without technically holding any. 2 senior managers were there too, along with the bank's representative, and an attorney I didn't recognize that Trevor must have hired recently. Owen opened the door and walked in first. The room went quiet. Every face turned expecting a stranger, some distant corporate voice they could manage and negotiate the way Trevor had always managed everything. I walked in behind him and I watched the recognition move across that room in sequence. Trevor's face did something complicated before it settled into stillness. The kind of stillness that comes right before something loud. Renee's pen hit the table before she even realized she'd dropped it. Hank's expression went carefully, deliberately blank. My mother stood up out of her chair, which wasn't something she did for anyone, and the fact that it happened without her deciding to told me everything about the state she was actually in. I walked to the head of the table. Trevor didn't move at first, like he was waiting for some instinct to tell him what to do, and it wasn't arriving fast enough. Then he stood. I sat down. "What are you doing here?" he said in a voice trying very hard to sound in control. Owen opened his case and laid out the documentation, clean and unhurried, the way he explained everything. Ridgeline Procurement Group and its holding entities had, through a series of fully legal transactions, acquired 72% of Bennett Ridge Machinery through the debt purchase and the minority equity buy. The beneficial owner of the controlling interest was me. Effective immediately, I held operational authority over the company, superseding the existing leadership on every material decision. The room took that news differently, depending on where you were sitting. The bank rep showed nothing, because none of it was news to him. The two senior managers exchanged a look that was mostly confusion, and underneath it, something that looked a lot like relief. I filed that away, because it told me plenty. Trevor started talking about theft, about conspiracy, about what our father would have thought, stringing words together fast in the way people do when the words matter less than filling the silence. Renee said nothing at all. Hank had his arms crossed, staring at the table, and I understood from his posture that he'd already run the odds on exactly this outcome weeks ago and concluded it was possible he'd just been wrong about his ability to stop it. I let Owen finish before I said a word. Then I looked around that table, not at Trevor specifically, at all of them, and told the two senior managers that nothing about daily operations was changing that morning. Normal schedules, no personnel decisions beyond what was being announced today, and nothing without proper notice and process. My first priority was stabilizing the company, not disrupting it. Then I told them and the bank representative they were free to go. The room shrank down to my family, Owen and me. Trevor's removal as CEO was effective immediately, exactly as stipulated in the agreement he'd signed the day before, without fully understanding what it meant, because he hadn't yet known who was on the other side of it. Renee was suspended from her role as CFO pending a full legal audit of the company's financials going back 5 years. Hank was locked out of every financial system, vendor account, and supplier contract until that audit concluded. My mother kept her board seat in name, but with voting shares too small to move anything without my consent. Trevor told me I'd stolen the company. He said it with the specific conviction of a man who'd landed on a story he genuinely liked, like the neatness of the accusation made it true on its own. I told him I'd purchased a controlling interest in a company its own leadership had driven to the edge of insolvency through transactions that were legal, documented, and fully transparent to every authority with jurisdiction over them. I told him if he wanted to contest it in court, he was welcome to, and Owen would hand his attorney every document he needed. I said all of it without raising my voice, because there was no version of that conversation where volume would have gotten me anywhere. And because I'd spent 3 years learning that composure isn't the absence of feeling. It's the decision not to let feeling decide the outcome. Trevor left first, Hank right behind him. Renee left without looking at me. My mother stayed at the table after the others cleared out, hands folded in front of her, looking at the wood grain instead of at me. She told me she hadn't planned what happened on that mountain. She said it carefully, not that it hadn't happened. Not that the outcome had been some accident, just that she hadn't planned it. What she meant, though she never said it this plainly, was that she'd arrived at that moment through a string of smaller decisions that each felt manageable at the time. Letting Trevor handle my objections. Agreeing to come on that hike when some part of her must have understood what he intended. And then standing on that trail, saying what she said and turning around. She hadn't planned it, she'd permitted it. That's a different kind of responsibility, and in some ways a more deliberate one, because permission requires a moment of clear-eyed awareness that pure planning never does. She said she'd been trying to save what my father built. I told her what I'd come to understand as true, that my father built a company, and she'd sacrificed her daughter to protect the people actively destroying it. I said it without anger, because I'd run out of anger somewhere in year 2. What was left was quieter. Not forgiveness exactly, just an accurate understanding of what had happened and why, which isn't the same thing as forgiveness, but I've come to think it's more durable. She asked me not to pursue the family any further. She meant legally. She meant the audit, the files Owen was already preparing to hand to the proper authorities. I told her that whatever the audit found would go exactly where it needed to go, because I wasn't willing to do for her now what I'd been asked to do 3 years ago: protect the people responsible from what they'd chosen. I wasn't in that room to punish her. I also wasn't in that room to protect her. I was there because the company was mine now, and this was a conversation that had to happen before I could move forward with any of it clean. She looked at me directly then, for the first time since I'd walked in. Something in her expression I hadn't seen there before. Something I still can't name exactly: the look of someone standing at the end of a version of herself, with no idea yet what comes next. I reached into my bag and set the small wooden box on the table between us and opened it. My father's compass sat inside, brass casing worn smooth, needle still perfectly true, because he always maintained the things he actually valued. I'd carried it out of those mountains in my jacket pocket the night they found me, and kept it for 3 years the way you keep that something that stands in for a question you haven't finished answering. I told her what he'd taught me with that compass, back when I was young enough to think being lost was a catastrophe instead of just a condition with a solution. It doesn't care where you're standing or how disoriented you feel. It only points to true north, and from there, you find the rest of your own way. I told her, when you're lost, you don't keep following the people who led you the wrong way. You find your own direction. Then I left the room. The audit ran 11 weeks and confirmed everything the records had already suggested: that the damage went deeper than any one person's decisions, and that there was more than enough for the relevant authorities to act on. I handed everything over and stepped back entirely. It wasn't mine to manage anymore. What I focused on instead was the company itself. 2 days after the acquisition closed, I spoke to the full staff, around 110 people gathered in the main assembly floor, most of whom had spent the past year working under a fog of uncertainty they'd had no say in creating. I didn't give a speech about vision. I told them the truth in terms honest enough to matter, without going further than they needed. I told them the problems the company had faced weren't the result of their work. Those problems came from decisions made above them, by people who were no longer in those seats. And then I told them the thing I most wanted them to hear. You were never the problem. One of the floor supervisors, a man who'd been there since my father's era, whose name I'd known since I was a teenager, started clapping. Nothing dramatic about it. Just the kind of acknowledgement people offer when something genuine lands, and it moved across that room in a way I found, despite everything, hard to receive without feeling it in my chest. Sam flew in from Millbrook the following week to help hold down Ridgeline's Oregon side remotely, while I stayed in Cedar Falls through the transition. He ran that end with the same steadiness he'd brought to everything since day one, and having him carry that weight gave me the room to focus completely on what needed rebuilding here. Trevor lost the CEO title and, within the year, was still dealing with personal liability exposure his attorney was managing the last time I checked in on it. Renee reached a settlement I wasn't a party to. Hank's vendor contracts were terminated, and whatever investigation followed proceeded through channels that were no longer mine to track. My mother kept her nominal board seat, which in practical terms meant nothing at all, and I never saw her in a professional setting again. 1 year after the acquisition closed, the company turned profitable again. Not dramatically, not in a way that made headlines. Just quietly, the way real financial health tends to arrive, once the structural rot has actually been dealt with, and the work is finally allowed to produce results on its own. Owen and I decided to rename it. We called it Ridgeline Mountain Industries, tied to the geography, tied to the company I'd already built in Oregon, without needing to reference the old name or the history that came attached to it. My father's name wasn't on the new sign, but his actual values, the ones I watched him practice, not the ones people claimed after he was gone, those were built into the structure itself, in how we treated suppliers and kept commitments and made decisions built to hold up under real scrutiny. That felt like a more honest inheritance than a name on a building ever could. That autumn, after the company turned its first profitable year, I drove back to Widow's Ridge alone, on a clear day with a stable forecast, and I took the trail up to Copper Notch, the same trail, the same overlook. I stood exactly where I'd fallen, where I'd called after people who had already decided to leave. The mountains hadn't changed. The wind still moved through that high, thin silence the way it always had, indifferent to everything underneath it. I stayed a long time. 3 years earlier, I had lain in the snow on that mountain and understood exactly what my family was capable of. Standing there again, I understood something else. The worst thing they'd done wasn't leaving me there. The worst thing was that they'd been completely confident I wouldn't survive it. And the reason that still mattered, standing in that clean autumn cold, was that their confidence had shown me without any ambiguity, left to hide behind exactly who I actually was. Not who they thought I was, not who I'd spent years trying to be for their benefit, who I was when there was nothing left but the choice between moving and stopping. I kept moving. I built something they couldn't take from me, and then I went back and bought the thing they thought they were protecting, and none of it ever required me to become someone I wasn't. I turned away from the overlook and started back down the mountain. I knew exactly where I was going. If there's one thing I want you to take with you before this ends, it's this. The people who try to shrink you, who take your phone, your keys, your seat at the table, your name out of the record, they're counting on exactly one thing. That you'll stay gone, that the cold, the distance, the silence will finish what they started. What I learned at the bottom of that mountain was that the strongest answer was never revenge. It was returning on my own terms, built with my own hands, on my own time. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because sometimes the most important thing one person can do for another is remind them you are not finished yet. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual, company, or institution.